question 12. Call the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister for Infrastructure what powers the Department has to assess the condition of public sector local authority housing, when local authority housing was last assessed, and if he will make a statement.
Call the Minister for Infrastructure to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Ramsey for his question and can clarify that, in short, there are no explicit powers enabling the Department to inspect and assess the condition of local authority public sector housing. However, housing is a local government function and receives substantial government funding in the form of housing deficiency payments, and as such, the following provisions apply. Part 1 of the Local Government Act 1985, Part 4 of the Housing Act 1955, brackets section 47A, Part 5 of the Housing Act 1955, and the Tynwald Resolution of 20th of October 1999. The condition of public sector housing is continually assessed by its landlords. However, in answer to the Honourable Member's question, the last sector-wide assessment was during 2016-17, when all local housing authorities, guided and assisted by the Department, compiled an estate-by-estate stock survey assessment. This stock assessment was used to develop short, mid and long-term housing investment plans in line with the property requirements. Furthermore, the Department has used the information to benchmark the island's public sector housing stock against social housing in the United Kingdom. The island's stock is, on average, of a lower age and of comparable thermal efficiency. This perhaps is not surprising considering the significant investment programme during the last 20 years in which the local authority capital programme has averaged in excess of £13 million per annum, which includes planned annual maintenance of around £2.5 million. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Given that the Minister has just acknowledged there are no explicit powers in place for the Department to monitor the condition of local authority housing, and that the last sector-wide assessment was taken in 2016-17, I wonder if he could advise how he was able on the 18th of August this year to respond to Mr Thomas's question about public sector affordable housing by stating there are currently no public sector units in occupation which are deemed unfit. How is he able to make that statement if actually there hasn't been an assessment of public sector housing? And given that there hasn't been an assessment of public sector housing in the last 4 years, is the Minister satisfied that the standards that do exist for public sector housing are adequate?
Minister to reply.
Okay, thank you, Mr Speaker. I will come back to the Honourable Member with absolute clarification on the specific point he's asked us to the evidence base for my answer to the previous question. However, clearly, fitness for occupation is an area that the Department for Environment, Food and Agriculture monitors very closely, and if houses are not fit for occupation, that is something which I would expect them and their inspectors, their team, to be following up on. In terms of standards that Mr Hooper has referred to in the question, I don't have the professional expertise to make the assertion that he is looking for in terms of my view on the standards of social housing, but the benchmark analysis does show that our housing compares very, very favourably with the UK comparators, and that work was undertaken using data provided by a UK housing consultancy. So I do believe that generally our housing condition is pretty good, but there are clearly pockets where it may fall short, and my suggestion would be, where that's the case, those need to be flagged to the specific landlords as a first point of reference.
Supplementary question, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I wasn't asking the Minister what his personal view was on the condition of public sector property. I was asking him whether his view as a Minister in charge of policy was that the regulations set minimum standards for public sector properties are adequate. And the reason for asking this question is the Minister was bringing forward a landlord registration bill to set minimum standards for the private sector on the Isle of Man, and has previously asserted that this bill does not need to cover the public sector because regulations that exist are currently adequate. And he's just stood up and said he's not able to make that assertion today, which is very concerning. It's also quite concerning that he passed the buck over to the Department of Environment when in previous answers to questions along these lines, the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture has not been able to confirm the split between complaints for private sector and public sector housing. In fact, they've also been unable to confirm that all the complaints were in relation to private sector housing, which strongly implies they have received complaints around the standard of public sector property on the Isle of Man. So, really, Minister, the question I'm asking is, if public sector regulations are adequate and the same standards apply to public and private sector, which again has been stated in response to some questions, what is the impetus for bringing in more regulation for the private sector? If public sector regulation is not adequate and therefore we need to lift up the whole housing stock on the Isle of Man, why his proposed bill doesn't also include the public sector?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, just to start with, the bill is a very focused bill on the private rented sector, and the reason for that is that we don't have the visibility around that sector. There's
visibility on the public sector.
Sorry, could I finish, Mr. Hooper, please? There is not the visibility around the private rented sector. There is inadequate knowledge of the number of properties, of who the landlords are, the conditions of those properties. There is much better visibility around the public sector. And as I've already said, there are some clear governance around it in terms of the 4 pieces of legislation which I referred to. Now, Mr. Hooper, I know, likes his detail. So, Part 1 of the Local Government Act 1985 allows the Department to make inquiries of local authorities and require such reports and returns of information as may be required from time to time by the Department or by Tynwald. The Department may also, by regulation, specify and monitor the minimum standards to be achieved by the local authorities in discharge of their functions. Part 4 of the Housing Act 1955, Section 47A, says that investment in public sector housing by local authorities is subject to central controls, with the Department having significant oversight of the development programme and the sector as a whole. It also governs the financial management of the property portfolio, their borrowing and their annual revenue and capital expenditure estimates for housing accommodation being approved by the Department. The Department may also apply conditions to deficiency funding, and the Tynwald resolution sets out the conditions for receipt of funding, which amongst other things requires engagement with the Department by the local housing authorities and conformance with policies such as the All Ireland policy. So that is a very different environment. Whether those individual regulations and standards are adequate or not is a separate question, but the governance around public housing is significantly different from that around private housing, and I'm sure Mr. Hooper will look forward to continuing this debate as we move the landlord registration bill through its passage. Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, that concludes the time available for questions this morning. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that Standing Order 3512 be suspended to enable the remaining questions for oral answer to be taken at the sitting.
Very happy to second that, Mr. Speaker.
I put the question that standing orders be suspended to permit the remaining questions to be taken at this sitting. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Now, I had 3 members on my list with regards to question 12. I'd propose to complete question 12 and then move on to the remaining 2. Is that agreed, honourable members? Agreed. Thank you. Go on, Mr. Quine, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the Minister's answer to the earlier question with regard to money received by local authorities from central government in order to keep their housing stock in an acceptable state of repair, could the Minister confirm that when significant structural renovations are undertaken by the local authorities, that the departments are informed as to the manner of such? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, clearly, if local authorities are undertaking significant structural renovations, there needs to be dialogue with the department in terms of their plans and any financial aspects of that. And in terms of the delivery of that, support can be available from the department centrally. But if you've got specific concerns about any particular scheme, happy to pick those up direct.
Supplementary question, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I hope the Minister doesn't mind me asserting that we do know exactly how many private sector rented houses from the excellent survey carried out by DEFRA in the last couple of years. Can the Minister advise why the department, his department, is not seeking to legal powers to assess the condition of public sector local authority housing rather than to extend its empire into private sector housing, given it's got no experience of assessing the condition of any sort of housing by the sound of it directly?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much. Well, it's not an either-or situation, Mr Speaker. If the department felt it needed to extend its powers in the public sector arena, then it would clearly come forward and propose to do so. The Landlord Registration Bill, which I think Mr Thomas is referring to here, probably, although that's clearly not the question that's in front of us, does move the whole governance around private sector rented accommodation forward. However, those minimum standards that landlords will have to comply with, those minimum standards are in place today, Mr Speaker, and the issue that we're seeking to address, amongst others, is to improve the governance around the rented sector and to improve the visibility and transparency, to ensure that we can address in some cases, in thankfully a minority of cases, but in some cases some very poor housing standards that people of this island, the vulnerable people in particular, as highlighted by the Tynwald Select Committee for the Accommodation of Vulnerable Young People, absolutely highlighted the conditions that some people on this island unfortunately have to live in. And I think, Mr Speaker, it's our duty to try and improve those outcomes for people.
Final supplementary, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Minister talked quite a bit about visibility there, and he listed off a whole range of regulations and powers the Department has to act, yet it chooses not to. It's surprising to me that when I asked the Minister for Environment, Food and Infrastructure about the condition of private sector properties, he is able to tell me that 16.3% of privately owned sector housing stock was found to be in an unsatisfactory condition. And yet when I asked the Minister for Infrastructure the same question about public sector housing, he's completely unable to provide me with that information. In fact, he has previously stated, in answer to questions in another place, that the Department does not hold detailed data on the condition of individual public sector properties generally and is only able to comment in respect of properties it itself manages. So, when the Minister talks about we need to improve visibility over the private sector stock, does he not agree that actually his department needs to do more to improve visibility over the condition of public sector stock that his department is actually responsible for regulating?
Minister to reply.
I'm quite happy to accept the point that there is benefit in improving the visibility over public sector stock as well. However, we have very strong relationships with all the landlords, and those landlords are well-established, reputable organisations who are within a governance framework. So it is not the same issue as we face in the private sector, where there is all the issues that I've already touched on, Mr Speaker, and I'm quite happy to try and level up if need be. If Mr Hooper feels that we need to bring the standards in the public sector up, I'm quite happy to do that. But I'm not going to take my eye off the ball in terms of raising the standards in the private rented sector where that is necessary, Mr Speaker.